Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle, the show, as y'all know, that brings you the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy, the free society, especially within the context of the burning issues of our time. And one of the burning issues, as y'all know, is foreign policy. How the U.S. government, and especially the national security branch of the government, the Pentagon, the CIA, the NSA, interact with the people of the world. Specifically, what I want to talk to y'all about today is one of the most evil and immoral measures of foreign policy that the U.S. government has imposed on people in foreign lands. And that policy is sanctions, or economic embargoes. I think it would be difficult to find a more repugnant, in a moral sense, foreign policy tool than this, except, of course, with the exception of assassinations or invasions or coups or other such measures. But sanctions fall right in there as well as embargoes, because they do target people with death, just like an invasion. With an invasion, they're going to go in there and start killing people, shooting people, dropping bombs on people, like we saw with Iraq. With sanctions, the result is no different. It's a more benign way of killing. It's a more respectable way of killing. It doesn't have the stigma that like state-sponsored assassinations have. And sanctions have become really a sort of a normalized part of American life. Everybody just sort of accepts them. The mainstream press writes about them as normal. You've got the mainstream press even complaining about foreigners who are trying to evade sanctions and reporting them, snitching on them, trying to figure out how to get these foreigners to comply with U.S. sanctions. And it's really a classic example of the banality of evil, where everybody lives within this evil system, but everybody just treats it as normal and figures out ways to enforce them and make them work more efficiently. Now, everyone targets terrorism. I mean, everybody condemns terrorism. And why is that? Well, terrorists target innocent civilians in a country with death as a way to achieve a goal from the government. They want the government to do something, and the way they do that, they say, well, we're going to kill innocent people until you finally succumb. And the idea is that the government will say, oh, gosh, we really don't want any more innocent people killed with these terrorist bombs. And so, okay, we'll sit down at the negotiating table and see if we can work things out. And of course, the reason it's so repugnant is because they're willing to kill innocent people as a way to achieve a political goal. Everybody condemns that. Well, except the terrorists, of course. But the U.S. government certainly condemns it. I mean, that's what the whole war on terrorism is supposedly all about. And yet, the perverse irony in all this is that sanctions do the same thing. They're the exact same thing in terms of how they target innocent people. You see, the idea is that by putting sanctions on a country, the people of that country will become impoverished. They will perhaps even starve to death. In Iran, for example, there's been plane crashes because the Iranians have been unable to keep their planes in high maintenance because of sanctions. But that's the goal, is to kill Iranians or to kill other people as a way to get the Iranian government to bend the knee, so to speak, to recognize the supreme worldwide authority of the U.S. government and to comply with its wishes. I mean, that's the entire aim of sanctions, is target the innocent people of a country and with the aim of getting their government to succumb to the will and the orders of the U.S. empire. Now, one of the oldest systems of sanctions has been against the Cuban people. And again, we call it an embargo. It's just a variation of the word sanctions. The idea is that they criminalize the action of American citizens, the U.S. government does, who dare to go and spend money in Cuba. Now, a lot of people think it's illegal to travel to Cuba. It actually isn't. The U.S. government did not want to be put in the position of being a government that suppressed freedom of travel, which has long been considered a fundamental, natural, God-given right. So they didn't want to be labeled, the destroyer of this right. So they said, well, we'll just do a variation here, and we'll make it a felony offense for Americans to spend money there without our permission. You see, if you get their permission, it's okay, but if you don't get their permission, then you're a criminal. So for all practical purposes, I mean, this is where the hypocrisy comes in, of course, that for all practical purposes, it's a ban on travel. But the idea is that if we can just starve and impoverish the people of Cuba, they will rise up in a revolution and oust the communist regime there and install another pro-U.S. regime. Prior to the communist regime taking power in 1959, there was a brutal dictator, right-wing dictator, pro-U.S. dictator named Fulgencio Batista, just corrupt to the core, partnered with the mafia and so forth. But since he was considered a pro-U.S. dictator and he would essentially follow orders of the U.S. government, he was considered okay, despite the fact that he was doing brutal things. I mean, there's a reason why there was a revolution there against this guy. And the reason was because he was so tyrannical, corrupt, immoral, brutal. And so the result, of course, was this communist regime, and which the U.S. national security establishment said this was the height of the Cold War, that this posed a grave threat to U.S. national security, that America could not stand with a communist country 90 miles away from American shores. And so that was the original idea of the embargo, along with the assassination attempts against Castro, trying to murder him. And an important thing to keep in mind here is that Cuba never attacked the United States in all this. They never threatened to attack the United States. Their only sin, if you will, was wanting to be left alone. And of course, the Pentagon, the CIA said, we cannot leave you alone. You're a communist regime. You're a threat to our national security. We need to oust you. And so the idea was just impoverish the Cuban people, and it worked. I mean, I traveled to Cuba many years ago, and people are on the verge of starvation there. And now it's not just the embargo, of course. It's also their socialist system. The socialist system has terribly impoverished them, but they're like in the middle of a vice, where on one side of the vice they're being squeezed by their socialist system, and on the other side of the vice they're being squeezed by the U.S. economic embargo. And make no mistake about it, I mean, if any American gets caught spending money there, on his return, U.S. officials will prosecute him. They'll arrest him, prosecute him, get a grand jury indictment against him, they'll prosecute him in federal court, and they will do their best to lock him up in jail. So the irony is that in this Cold War battle against socialism in Cuba, which goes on to this day. I mean, the Cold War ended in 1989, but that didn't end the animosity that the Pentagon and the CIA have toward this regime. And so that's why the embargo continues to target the Cuban people with impoverishment and death by starvation or illness or whatever. And it's brutally enforced not only against Americans, but against foreigners. I mean, here's the real irony of this thing, is that the U.S. government expects all other foreign countries to comply with its sanctions. And the way they enforce this is at first they just said, we're not going to let you transact business in the United States. And so, I mean, that's a big penalty for international businesses. You can't use the banking system and so forth. So the embargo against Cuba, people often say, oh, well, other foreign countries could still, do business there. Yeah, but the U.S. government, that's a big penalty when they say, well, if you do that, you're not going to do business here. But they've actually gone a step further. In Iran, for example, they now go after any country that violates their sanctions, the U.S. sanctions, in a criminal sense. I mean, that's why they are holding under house arrest this woman who is an executive with Huawei, the telecommunications giant in China. I forget what her name is, but she's like, a huge executive in this company. She was just changing planes in Canada She wasn't planning on coming to the United States at all. And so the U.S. officials had her arrested. And they're now attempting to extradite her. She's under house arrest in China. They did release her on a conditional bond to stay in a hotel or something like that. But they are fighting fiercely to bring this woman back to the United States. Now, what is she charged with? With violating U.S. sanctions on Iran. Now, this is not an American woman. This is a Chinese woman. But because her company and she did business with Iran, supposedly, and somehow violated U.S. sanctions, she's subject to being criminally prosecuted. I mean, so in other words, anybody anywhere in the world has to comply with imperial law, because the law of the United States is worldwide. It's a global empire, and they feel that everybody should comply with U.S. law. I mean, this is inane, ridiculous. And of course, the Iranian people are the ones that are paying the price for this. They're suffering mightily, especially in the midst of this pandemic, where, getting treatment and medicines is so vitally important. It's impossible to measure the deaths that can be attributed to the sanctions themselves. It's just a brutal, cruel, horrific, immoral, evil policy. Again, because it targets people. And the Iranian people have suffered mightily. Now, they're not the only ones. If we go back to Iraq, now keep in mind, here's another country like Cuba that is a third world country, never attacked the United States. And the United States says, well, your dictator here isn't doing what we want him to do. He's independent. And so we've got to do something about that. And so after the Persian Gulf War, when U.S. forces did not go to Baghdad to oust Saddam from power, they simply removed the troops from Kuwait. The right wing was outraged. Oh, we should have gone to use the excuse to get Saddam Hussein. He's a threat to U.S. national security, which is always ridiculous. I mean, whenever they talk about these foreign threats to national security. In fact, the word national security doesn't even have an objective meaning. Nobody's ever been able to define it as whatever they want it to be. And so what they did after the Persian Gulf War is they imposed sanctions on Iraq. Now, these were among the most brutal sanctions in history and very, very effective. They had already destroyed the water and sewage treatment plants in Iraq several years before, during the Persian Gulf War, intentionally, knowing that this would help spread infectious illnesses among the Iraqi people. I mean, if you can't treat the water, the sewage-filled water, that's a big problem with respect to health. And sure enough, the people who started dying in large numbers were the children of Iraq. And this is in the 1990s. And so there's tremendous anger that's welling up in the Middle East over this. Imagine, day after day, children dying, and the U.S. knew it. They didn't care. This is, again, where that banality of evil comes in. These are just sanctions. We're just imposing sanctions. What's the problem? It's just sanctions. And then they said, well, Iraq has the solution to it. It's really Iraq that's responsible for the deaths of these children, because Saddam Hussein could do as we tell him to do. He could leave office, and then the sanctions would be lifted. So in other words, their argument was that he's responsible for the deaths from the sanctions because he could leave whenever he wanted and the sanctions would be lifted. Well, the matter came to a head somewhat in, I think it was 1996, when Madeleine Albright, who was the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, she was asked by 60 Minutes whether the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children from the sanctions had been worth it. And she thought for a moment, and she said, well, yeah, it's a tough issue, but yeah, it's worth it. I mean, how can the deaths of innocent children ever be worth anything, any political goal? I mean, it's just phenomenal. And yet, not one single U.S. official, not one member of Congress, not one member of the federal judiciary, not one member of the executive branch, President Clinton, her boss, none of them condemned that statement. And my hunch is the reason they didn't condemn it is because they agreed with it. Yeah, it's worth it to kill all these children. How else are we going to get rid of Saddam Hussein? And again, remember, Iraq had never attacked the United States. And so here the United States is essentially waging war, aggressing throughout the 90s by killing citizens. I mean, imagine if a foreign regime were assassinating or were sanctioning the U.S. that was causing massive deaths among the American people. My hunch is that there'd be a lot of outrage in this country, a lot of condemnation. But the fact that the U.S. government was doing it, well, that just made it okay. And the sanctions actually continued after she made that statement for another 5 years or so, until George W. Bush used the 9/11 attacks as the excuse to do what his father had not done, and that was go to Baghdad to oust Saddam Hussein from power. And and y'all remember all the hype there. Oh, they're WMDs and they're coming to get us, and nuclear bombs and mushroom clouds, and it was all this lies, a war built on lies to justify what they were doing and to garner public support for it. And I remember there were so many people saying, "Oh, they must have access to information that we don't have. We have to trust them. We have to believe in them." And of course, at the Future of Freedom Foundation, we were opposing this most fiercely. We knew what was going on. It was a sham. They were just using the lies as the excuse, just like they did at the Gulf of Tonkin with Vietnam. I mean, this is how they operate. And it really goes to show you the sanctions and the lies and the assassinations, everything, that the moral perversion that's taken place in this country ever since the U.S. government was turned into a national security state. I mean, y'all know that I've done a lot of work in this area, that if we're going to be fighting for freedom, and that's what we libertarians are supposed to be fighting for, and limited government, then a necessary prerequisite for that is the elimination of the national security state. Because a national security state and freedom are opposites to each other. A national security state is a totalitarian form of governmental structure. Myanmar is a national security state. And I assume you all know what's going on over there. Pinochet's regime in Chile, which garnered the full support of the U.S. government, including the Pentagon and the CIA, that was a national security state. Egypt, Pakistan, North Korea, Russia, China, these are all national security states. And it is impossible for a person to be considered free under a national security state. Now, one may convince himself that he's free, but that's just delusionary. And of course, we all know delusions lead to psychoses and so forth. The fact is, Americans are not living in a free society. And one of the reasons is because you've got the domestic issues like the welfare state, the managed economy, the drug war, and so forth. But the other reason we're not living in a free society is the existence of the national security state, which is the opposite of a limited government republic. Under a limited government republic, the government's powers are very limited, which enables people to experience what freedom is all about. But when you've got a government that wields and sometimes exercises omnipotent totalitarian powers, that is not a free society. And so, we now live in a society, and have since the conversion after World War II to a national security state, under a government that wields the power to assassinate people, including Americans. Omnipotent power, non-reviewable power. They are the final judges of who's going to be killed, murdered. I mean, even Lyndon Johnson, who wasn't really the paragon of morality in all this, political morality, he called it Murder Incorporated, this policy of state-sponsored assassinations, and that's what it is. And sanctions are just a variation on the assassination theme. They're assassinating people, but they're doing it in a way that looks respectable, a way that looks benign. But the person's just as dead, whether he dies of illness or starvation or some related type thing. He's just as dead as if a bullet enters his head. This is what the national security state way of life has done. It's perverted American values. It's upended our values to a point where, countless Americans go to church every Sunday and they kneel and they pray to God. And then Monday morning, they sit there and they just blindly support these kind of things or remain silent about them. And even worse, don't think there's anything wrong with them. They don't see the immorality, the evil, the horror of what the national security state way of life has done to human conscience, to people's conscience here in the United States in terms of killing innocent people. I mean, just imagine intentionally killing innocent people as a way to achieve a political goal. Now, woe to the person who takes this on. Now, y'all know that we're running a conference right now called the National Security State and the Kennedy Assassination. And people sometimes say, well, Jacob, what relevance does this have? That was more than 50 years ago. My answer always is, look around. I mean, there's a direct line from what happened during the Kennedy years to where we are today. I mean, look, when Kennedy went and gave his peace speech at American University, he was throwing the gauntlet down at these people. He said, we're enough of this Cold War nonsense, he said. We're going to have a regular, normal, peaceful, friendly relationship with Russia, with China, with the communist world. We're just going to peacefully coexist. They have their ideology. We have our ideology. Well, that's fine. We're going to end this hostile, tense relationship that the national security establishment has ginned up here during this entire Cold War. Well, we all know what happened to Kennedy when that conflict of visions took place. But look where we are today. I mean, you've got the national security establishment saying that Russia is a big enemy and ginning up hostile relations there and creating crises with Ukraine and so forth. And then now they're ginning up a crisis with China because, their war on terrorism seems to be fizzling out. People are demanding that they finally leave Afghanistan and Iraq and possibly the Middle East, Syria as well, which, of course, then means there's no more terrorism because that's what was producing the terrorism, is the interventionism in the Middle East and then later Afghanistan. But Kennedy was not only a man ahead of his time, he was ahead of our time. He was saying, to heck with all this. This is ridiculous. He was challenging these people and their vision for America and the future of America, challenging the national security establishment, which, by challenging the Cold War and their mindset of hostility toward other countries, he was challenging the justification for their existence. Do you see any challenge to that today in today's times? No president would dare. Now, President Trump alluded to it when he was campaigning, which I think is one of the main reasons he got elected. But as soon as he got in, something happened. Something really mysterious happened because he just caved into these people. And he started surrounding himself with all their people, all their generals, and Bolton. He started surrounding himself with warmongers. It was just bizarre. And then he gave in to the CIA after Trump promised that he was going to release all those long secret Kennedy assassination-related records of the CIA. The CIA waltzes into his office or something and says, "No, you're not," and he crumbled. And that's why those documents are still secret. National security, of course. If those records are released, the national security will be jeopardized after 50 some odd years. I mean, how ridiculous is that? But you see, Kennedy was ahead of his time. He was challenging them, and what members of Congress, are going to challenge them at a fundamental level with their sanctions? I don't hear any challenge to it. I don't hear any question. And of course, Biden's not about to. No president since Kennedy has taken on the national security establishment. And even, I think it was Congressman Schumer said, woe to the president who does it, because the intelligence establishments have ways of retaliation, and they do. It's the most powerful part of the government. Many of you know that I've recommended the great book, National Security and Double Government by Michael Glennon. And Glennon's thesis is very, very simple, and I subscribe to it. He says the real people running this government and then the country are the military intelligence establishment. That's where the real power is in this country. And the president's going to defer. When Biden selected Lloyd Austin as his Secretary of Defense, I have no doubts that was not his choice. That was the Pentagon's choice. They didn't want to jack with a civilian. They're in charge. They said, enough's enough. Let's get one of our people in there. And Biden said, okay. And that's the way we're going to see it throughout the Biden administration. Biden's going to defer to their authority all the way along. Now, they will create the appearance, as Glennon argues, of that the president's in charge and the Congress is in charge, but it's all a charade. That no member of Congress would dare to take on the military intelligence establishment. It's just not going to happen. They start targeting them with military bases. Cancellation of military bases in their districts or military projects, and no Congress can withstand that kind of pressure. The local press goes on the attack and says he's an ineffective congressman. He gets opposition, people running against him, saying we'll bring home the bacon, we'll be loyal to the Pentagon and the CIA. And of course, then you've got all the veterans there, military veterans and CIA veterans. They're not about to challenge the existence of the national security state at a fundamental level. They're not about to call for the restoration of a limited government republic to our land. There was a guy named Bert Sachs. It was a very interesting story and very revealing story. Heroic. Sachs was, I think, from Washington State, and he decided to violate the Iraq sanctions. And so he took over medicines and food and stuff and was helping them out. A genuine humanitarian, and he knew he was breaking the law, but that's what you have to do sometimes. You got to subscribe to your conscience. You got to follow your conscience. Conscience triumphs over these immoral, evil laws. So the U.S. went after Sachs, not surprisingly. This is their beloved sanctions he's violating. He's setting a precedent here. If they let him go, man, then boy, everybody might violate the sanctions and start following their conscience. So they didn't torture him. They didn't criminally prosecute him. They didn't waterboard him, but they did fine him. They fined him $10,000, and to his everlasting credit, it really is a heroic story. I've written about Sachs, S-A-C-H-S, on my website several times, so you can Google that name on fff.org, or just Google Bert Sachs and Iraq and sanctions. And so Sachs, to his everlasting credit, just fought him. Said, I'm not paying you a dime. And he kept fighting them, and I don't know how much he spent, fighting them. I don't know. I assume he had a lawyer. I'm not sure whether he was representing himself, but they were doing everything they could for years. It was like this obsession to get this guy. And what was great at the end, Sachs won. It was on a technicality. It wasn't because the courts ruled that he was morally right and he had the right to do this. It was some technicality that the government had failed to do something on time or something or other. And but he beat him. It was just awesome. It was just a story of real heroism. But it's very revealing that when you violate these people's sanctions, you better be prepared that they will come after you. It's like Snowden and Assange. They're going after Snowden and Assange, and not just out of retaliation, vengeance. Because think Assange and Snowden, they just told the truth. That's all they did. They disclosed the truth. And boy, in a national security state, there's dark, sordid, immoral, evil secrets going on. Along with the dark, sordid, immoral, evil actions that we all know about, like sanctions and assassinations and so forth. But there's dark secrets involved here too, and they revealed the secrets. And boy, the wrath of the national security state came crashing down, but not just out of vengeance, but as a message. They want to send a message to everybody else who works within the bowels of the national security establishment. Don't you even think about going down the road these guys have gone down, where they're doing things out of conscience, because this is what's going to happen to you. And that's what the idea of Sachs was, is that we're going to use Sachs as a messenger. We're going to go after him big time to let Americans know you can't do this. And of course, there's sanctions on the people of North Korea. Here's an intervention that should never have happened. This was a civil war from the beginning. There's no business of the U.S. government, but it was this Cold War mindset that said, oh no, there's an international communist conspiracy. It's based in Russia, and it's coming to get us, and it's enveloping Korea, and we've got to get over there. They, again, like all the other ones, an illegal intervention, illegal war. They never got a declaration of war as the Constitution requires it, which is ironic because every soldier takes an oath to support and defend the Constitution, but then when it comes to following orders, illegal orders to deploy to a country without that declaration of war, they all say, okay, yes, sir, and click their heels and do it. And those troops are still there, and they're the cause of the problem. The U.S. government's presence in Korea, that's why they want those nuclear weapons. They saw what happened to Iraq. They're not dumb. The U.S. invaded Iraq and ended up killing Saddam Hussein and put in a pro-U.S. regime. What they thought was a pro-U.S. regime, it actually turned out to be a pro-Iranian regime. But the reason they invade is because they know that these third world countries have no means of resistance. That's why Castro invited the Soviet Union to put those nuclear missiles there. because they figured the U.S. will balk when they see nuclear missiles there. And that's why North Korea has nuclear missiles, not to start a war with the United States, but to defend against the United States. And the best thing that could ever happen is lift all those sanctions against Iraq, against North Korea, and everybody else, of course. But lift the sanctions against North Korea and come home. Just bring all the troops home immediately. And then all of a sudden you've got a situation where North and South Korea are there to work out their own problems. And if they can't work them out, that's their problem. It's not the problem of the American people. But notice that if they can work out their problems and there's a war, those American troops are a tripwire. And that's all they are there for, to serve as a tripwire, to guarantee U.S. entry into the war. That's why the Pentagon keeps them there. That's why the CIA keeps them there. That if there's a war breakout, there's no debate. Should the U.S. get involved in this thing? Should there be a declaration of war? No, it's automatic because American troops will be among those killed. I mean, that's how they think of U.S. troops, too, is just these little sacrificial tripwires. So what we need to do in this country to get it back on the right track is we need to do a lot of soul searching. We need to do soul searching in terms of conscience, of right and wrong, and realize that it's not just foreign regimes that are engaged in some really horrific things like in Myanmar and other places, but that this national security state in our own government, our own society, has been doing some really horrific things too. And near the top of that list are the sanctions and the embargoes, along, of course, with the coups and the assassinations and so forth. If enough people will pursue conscience, I think more and more people will see this banality of evil that's inherent in this kind of system. And then we start looking at a much higher road here, a road not only to ending these things, but restoring a limited government republic to our land, which is the only way that we can achieve a free society. That's my